It's my great pleasure to introduce Kaare Strøm, who will give the keynote speech for tonight. So Kaare is Norwegian. He completed his PhD in 1984 in Stanford. Then he became associate professor in the University of Bergen, Norway. And then he went back to the US, or he went again to the US. He was assistant professor in the University of Minnesota, and then of California, San Diego, where he became full professor in 94. In 1990, he published his book Minority Government and Majority Rules, which I believe is taken from his PhD. Yes. So very nice PhD, Kaare. Congratulations. In this book, we see three choices that will continue throughout his career. First is the interest for the relation between political actors' preferences and institutional rules, and for the interaction between both. How actors are changed by rules, how rules are changed by actors. The relation between both. The second elements that we will find again is methodologically and theoretically comparative design and a commitment to rational choice, even if I will come back to that. And the third element is a kind of a touch of ambition, a lot of ambition and a touch of provocation, since Kaare explained in his book that minority governments were not especially weak, that there was a result of a choice by rational actors, and that they had their strength in themselves. In 1994, Kaare received the Steinrocken Prize in Comparative Social Science Research. In 1999, he published with his colleague Wolfgang Müller, with which he has produced so much collective book. He edited the book Policy, Office and Votes, where he follows the same vein of his PhD, but with a kind of, if I may say, of open-minded for a rational choice theorist, which, since he says that political actors are not just interested by votes, but that they could be interested by policy or offices, which in the rational world is still a sign of openness. He then edited 3 volumes, collective volumes, together with Wolfgang Müller and often with Torbjørn Bergman, let's say, on contemporary democracies and on coalition governments. 3 volumes published at Oxford University Press, and notably the book that the PhD students call the Blue Book in 2003 on delegation and accountability, where he develops his famous, this is one of your major contributions, this famous analysis in terms of principle, seeing democracies as a chain of delegation between principle and agent. This book had a great legacy for my generation, and if I was as provocative as you are sometimes, Kaare, I would wonder whether it's not too much in a sense now, since we see so many books taking this framework, so many ongoing research taking this framework of principle-agent. Among the most recent work of Kaare Strøm's, 2 appears as important, I guess. One is the Oxford Handbook of Legislative Studies, published in 2014 by Kaare with Thomas Salfeld and Shane Martin, which is now a reference into the field. And the other one is this comparisons between Nordic democracy in 2011, the Madisonian turn that we find again in the title of your presentation for today. And within this book, we see the continuity of your willingness to take seriously the institutions, political institutions, and also to take them comprehensively, from the ombudsman, for instance, to the organization of parliaments, to the patterns of coalition, of course. So Well, we are very, very happy in PADEMIA to have you for this speech, Kaare Strøm, and I give you the floor.
Thank you, Olivier. I think you've read my CV about as carefully as I've read it myself, and I certainly appreciate your kind words. And it's a pleasure for me to be here today. I'm going to talk to you about, the title of my talk is The Perils of Parliamentary Democracy and the Madisonian Turn. And it really springs out of, obviously, an interest in democracy and in a specific form of parliamentary democracy that I imagine that we all have in common in this room. And also a commitment, normative commitment, which I imagine many of us share also. And I have to say that being here in Brussels, right here and right now also, is a reminder that democracy, parliamentary democracy, rule of law, and a free civilian contestation of ideas is not something that we can take for granted, and that there are perils, that democracy is fragile, and that we need to think about ways in which we can most effectively and successfully defend and strengthen democracy. And that's essentially where my concerns start for the talk that I'm going to give today. But before we get there, I'll get off on what you may think is a strange tangent, but permit me. As political scientists, as scholars, we sort of thrive on name recognition. But I have to say that my name, whatever name recognition I have today, is minor compared to the name recognition that I had as a little kid. And this wasn't because I was intellectually precocious or anything, but it was because I happened to be named after my father. My father was a notable athlete. In the small town that I grew up in Norway, his name recognition was very large. And all I could say as a little boy, people asked me my name, I would say Kaare Strøm, and they would say, "Are you the son of the Kaare Strøm?" And I'd say, "Yes, that's my dad." And, you know, all sorts of doors would open themselves for me at that stage. And my dad is an athlete. He was a track and field athlete. He was a long and triple jumper, if those events mean anything to you. He won several national championships in Norway. And one, probably his most notable achievement, and the achievement for which he was most remembered and sort of appreciated, was the fact that on a nice summer day in Oslo, he set a national record for Norway in the triple jump of 15 meters and 49. That happened to be, which is 50 feet and 10 inches, if I'm correct in English translation, which happened to be not just a national record in Norway by a substantial margin. It was actually longer than anybody in Europe had jumped in the triple jump until that time. So it was a notable achievement. It was a record that would stand for a long time, and when I was a little boy, many years later, it was still the national record in Norway. And I remember the day that it was broken, and I was still a young boy. My father set that record less than a year before the Olympics. I think he had every right to expect, I don't know whether he actually did, but he had every right to expect that he would go to the Olympics and that he would have a chance to do quite well. But he never did. And when I give you the date when he set his record, you'll understand why. Because he set his national record on August 20th, 1939. And within a couple of weeks of that date, of course, the world changed dramatically. And in ways that people in Norway would not have anticipated. Norway had lived in peace for 125 years when my father did what he did. It had lived under the same constitution, the democratic constitution, for that length of time. But of course, all that changed in a very short period of time. And I think one lesson certainly is democracy is fragile, and you can't, even though you have durable institutions that are appreciated, they've lasted for a long time, you can't necessarily take them for granted. My first graph for you today that I'll show you shows you a little bit about what's happened to democracy in the world over the past 200 years, from 1800 and up until 2010. And you'll see the good news is, and the news is overwhelmingly good, right? Democracy started out being practiced in very few countries back in 1800. And over the time that's passed since that time, certainly the number of democracies around the world has risen dramatically. And those are that's the green scale that you see here in autocracies, the purple scale. But you also see that there have been setbacks. You can see that the 1930s was a time of that kind of a setback. Many former democracies ceased to be democracies in the 1930s, 1940s. The late 1960s and 1970s were similar decades of decline. And if you look at the very end of the scale, you'll see that the number of democracies rose dramatically in the world in the 1990s. But over the past 10 or 15 years, there's been quite a bit of backslide. So we can't take that for granted. And so that's a backdrop to what I want to talk about today, which is how we identify the perils of democracy and parliamentary democracy in particular, and what some of the remedies might be. And I'll start just by talking about what parliamentary democracy is, how we define it, and this all goes back to the blue book that Olivier talked about in just a few minutes ago, the book that I edited with Wolfgang Müller and Torbjörn Bergman a few years ago, where we actually give two definitions. We give what we call a minimal definition of parliamentary government, which is simply that the cabinet, the executive, is subject to parliamentary dismissal, that there's a confidence relationship between the executive and the legislature, and then a majority of members of the legislature, or the lower chamber typically, have the ability to vote the cabinet and with the prime minister out of office. That's what we call parliamentary government, excuse me. Then we have a broader, more ideal typical definition that goes to the relationships of delegation and accountability, again something that Olivier already mentioned to you, that tend to exist in parliamentary democracies, that we have a model of singular, indirect, and hierarchical delegation. And that separates those kinds of democracies from, for example, presidential democracies. And that's a setup that promotes efficiency, it promotes clarity of responsibility. It has a lot of virtues. Those are not necessarily the things I'm going to talk about today, since we're concerned about perils of democracy and challenges to democracy. I'm going to focus more on the sort of potential weak sides of the parliamentary model. In the book, in the blue book, we also have a couple of models that some of you may be familiar with, that just sort of that help you get a sense of, when I say hierarchical, simple, efficient model of delegation and accountability on top there, that's what we mean. You can contrast that with a presidential model such as the United States at the bottom, and the simple picture that I just want to convey here is things can get a lot more complex with a presidential model. Lines of responsibility are much more likely to cross. They're much more likely to be principals with multiple agents having similar tasks. They're likely to be agents that answer to multiple different principals. Think about bureaucrats in the U.S. system, for example, who may have to answer to that they're appointed by the president. They have to answer to the House of Representatives. They have to answer to the Senate. They're accountable to the courts legally. and they may even have to listen to state governments and governors. So there's a lot more lines of accountability and responsibility. I'm not going to talk much about presidential democracy today. I will focus more mainly on parliamentary democracy. That's what we're all interested in spell out a little bit of what we could call those kinds of perils, the potential frailties of parliamentary democracies. So that there are some things that we could call the static effects of parliamentary democracy that are sort of the downside of parliamentary democracy. The fact that that parliamentary democracy tends to lead to party dominance and often to very strongly cohesive political parties. Now you can see that as a strength, but you can also see that as a weakness. I think we had papers presented today that made the latter case. Compared to a presidential system, there's also a relative lack of horizontal constraint. It's not the same system of checks and balances that you have in a presidential system. The third point here is something that I think is actually quite important, and that is that the fusion of legislative and executive branches of government, the fact that the same party or the same parties are likely to be in charge of both of these branches, mean that parliamentarism has a tendency not to generate the same kind of incentives for legislative oversight of the executive as you tend to find in a system of checks and balances. And ultimately, the risk that we're facing in all of this is a tyranny of the majority. I'm not saying that that's a necessary consequence of parliamentarism, but it is at the far end one thing that we may have to worry about. And there are some dynamic effects that could result from all of this, a loss of confidence in institutions. I'm going to talk about Scandinavia in a little bit, and Scandinavia is not a place where we're seeing a lot of loss of confidence in institutions, but we have seen that in other parts of the world, Southern Europe, for example, where there is some survey evidence suggesting that. I'll talk about the rise of more extreme parties and the growing tensions that go along with that in the Scandinavian context. And here's the figure that speaks to those kinds of issues. This is simply a graph that shows you the percentage of votes given in national elections in the 3 Scandinavian countries, narrowly defined. And I apologize to the Finns and the Icelanders in the audience that I didn't include their countries. I'm simply looking at Denmark, Norway, and Sweden here. I don't think the picture would be terribly different if we expanded the scope. And also when I say extreme party support, I'm talking about parties to the left of the Social Democrats, to the right of the Conservatives. I'm not making normative judgments. I'm not saying you're a bad person if you ever voted for one of these parties. But I am saying these are parties that are sort of contributing to a sort of growing ideological or policy distance within these party systems, and that typically have little experience of governing. And as you can see, there's been a trend in all of these countries towards a strengthening, sort of long-term trend towards stronger parties of the extreme left or the extreme right in all of these Scandinavian countries. If we go back to the late 1960s, there were virtually no voters, less than 5% typically in these countries that voted for these parties. Even in the late 1980s, there were very low percentages. As of today, you'll see that those percentages range from about 20% and all the way up to almost 40% in the case of Denmark. And I should also say these numbers are largely driven by the radical right parties in these countries. The Danish People's Party, the Progress Party in Norway, and the Sweden Democrats, for example. So that's something to be somewhat concerned about. Now, I don't want to give you just sort of the threats and the perils and the bad news, but I also want to talk about one of the remedies, one that goes back a long time, and that I associate with the 4th President of the United States, James Madison, for the reasons that he probably wrote more systematically about this particular remedy than anybody else at his time, and that he also helped design institutions that sort of that embodied the spirit of those concerns that he raised in his writings. And you'll know about Madison from the Federalist Papers and, of course, from his design of the U.S. Constitution. And in some of the principles that Madison stood for, first of all, of course, separation of powers, checks and balances, the idea of pitting ambition against ambition so that the government would work more transparently and effectively that way. Madison was very much a supporter of a Bill of Individual Rights, and in fact, he was a prime author of the Bill of Rights that went into the U.S. Constitution, and he was also the prime author of the sort of previous Bill of Rights that went into the Constitution of the state of Virginia, and the U.S. version was largely a copy, or was derived from the Virginia version of this Bill of Rights. And what was particularly important I think I can safely say, to Madison in that context was the First Amendment, as it is in the United States, promoting free speech and religious freedom, and the prohibition against an established church at the same time of granting very liberal religious freedoms. And Madison also believed in a strong and independent judiciary, and over time, of course, that led to the kind of judicial review that the United States has practiced for a long time to protect the kind of rights that he had written into the Bill of Rights. Now, you can read this. I want to talk about how this has played out in the Scandinavian countries, and at first I want to just combat one sort of idea that maybe come to your mind immediately, and that is that Madison is really the designer of presidentialism, and what he had to say doesn't have much to say to Scandinavia or other parliamentary democracies. And that is really reading a sort of debate about regime types that we have in our day and age back into Madison's time, and is not really a very it's not sort of honoring the context in which he did his work, because Madison was really writing at a time when he was trying to find a form of government to replace the British monarchy with some sort of republican government, and there was no model in the real world of parliamentarism without a monarch at that point. In fact, that didn't exist until about 50 or 60 years later. And furthermore, the first plan that Madison launched for the U.S. Constitution, the so-called Virginia Plan, would have effectively made the United States into a parliamentary democracy if it had been adopted, because that was a plan by which the Congress would elect the president. I don't know whether you're aware of that, but it didn't turn out that way. That didn't become the model of the U.S. Constitution. But Madison's ideas were actually quite compatible with some of the major principles of parliamentary democracy as it has evolved. Now, Norway and Sweden adopted constitutions in the early 1800s that became the second and third oldest democratic constitutions in the world after that of the United States. And they remained that way until Sweden decided that they wanted to modernize their constitution back in the 1970s. And then they yielded their place as the second oldest constitution to Norway. Now Norway is the second oldest constitution after that of the United States. And in many ways, these constitutions were influenced by Madison, particularly the Norwegian Constitution. Norwegian Constitution makers had read the U.S. Constitution. They had read many of the documents, the Federalist Papers. They had also read the constitutions of several of the states before, the state constitutions in the U.S. before the federal constitution, and they were certainly beholden to a number of the ideas that were formulated in those constitutions, and particularly by Madison. And they were so much influenced by that Norway became the only country in the 1800s, other than the United States, for example, to adopt a model of judicial review and to vest that kind of power in the judicial branch, the power to overturn legislation on constitutional grounds. That's a power that the Norwegian Constitution, that rose as a convention in Norway by the 1860s. And there were other constitutional features that are perhaps not so directly Madisonian, but speak to the same kinds of aims, such as, for example, the Ombudsman institution, which is really a Swedish invention, and that has been quite an export product. Now, one area where the Scandinavian countries, I'm sorry to say, did not copy Madison and did not go along with his ideas was in the areas of religious liberties. Not only did Sweden and Norway establish Lutheran churches, and you can certainly have an established church and still have quite a tolerant society societally. But both Norway and Sweden, I'll excuse the Danes here because they established religious freedom in 1849 when they got their constitution. But both Sweden and Norway, in fact, had very restrictive constitutional rules about non-Lutherans. So until after World War II, you basically needed a permission of the government in Sweden to switch from the Lutheran Church to another religious community. And if you didn't want to switch to an organized religious community, that was bad news. If you wanted to leave the Lutheran Church and become a Methodist, that was one thing. But leaving the Lutheran Church and becoming a non-member was not an option for a very long time, certainly not until after World War II. And in Norway, the Constitution of 1814 actually banned Jews and Catholic orders from the country. And it wasn't until the 1950s that Catholic orders, such as Jesuits, for example, were allowed into Norway. Not the finest moment of the Norwegian Constitution, but be that as it may. But those kinds of differences aside, what we do see in Scandinavia today is what I would call a turn towards a new Madisonianism. And that's what, again, Olivia mentioned our book on the Madisonian turn in Scandinavian countries, what we are concerned about in that book and what we document. And it certainly has gone along with the liberalization of things like freedom of religion and in fact with the disestablishment of the churches, which has happened in Sweden in 2000, is happening in Norway next year, and a proliferation of this ombudsman institution. Norway had its first ombudsman in 1952. Now there are 9 different ombudsmen in Norway at the national level with all kinds of differentiated tasks. And most importantly, in the growing judicialization and the growing importance of rights established through domestic and international legislation and upheld by the courts. And the Supreme Court in Norway has actually taken a very important role in as a protector of the Constitution and also of international human rights agreements. And invalidated a number of important legislation. I won't go into the details here, but in 1976, as you'll see here, Professor Eckhoff, who was quite a prominent judicial lawyer, professor of law at the University of Oslo, made this famous statement that the power of judicial review exists in the Norwegian Constitution today, but it probably won't be exercised. And later on the same year, the Norwegian the Norwegian Supreme Court went on to invalidate one of the laws that had just been passed, and then it went on from strength to strength, so that in 2010 it invalidated 3 different laws in the same year and different kinds of decisions. And in 2015, last year, the Norwegian Parliament actually adopted an amendment to the Constitution that explicitly makes judicial review a power vested in the Supreme Court and the courts generally. So that's one important element of this Madisonian turn that we're witnessing in Scandinavia, and that I think is quite important. Now, the next question that you might have is, does it actually matter? Do these kinds of Madisonian constraints do anything to sustain democracy and to make these countries better places to live or whatever? And to answer that question, I won't just look at the Scandinavian countries, so the Western European countries, but I'll refer you to some research that I've done with various co-authors on political power sharing across the world, where we collected data on power sharing institutions of all sorts across 180 different countries in the world. And that basically means all countries in the world with a population of at least 500,000. And again, I apologize to the people from Luxembourg and to the people from Iceland that they didn't quite make it into this survey, but I think nevertheless it's quite an expansive, quite a global survey. And we look at 19 different institutions that we could conceive as power sharing in some ways, mainly constitutional statutory provisions, but also some behavioral practices. And what I'm going to talk about here, some of that you can see in the article that we published in the British Journal of Political Science last year. And our aim there was simply to identify different patterns of power sharing, and I'll talk about what difference they make later. This is the results of our factor analysis, where we're looking for clusters of these institutions across all of these different 180 countries. And this is time series, so we have annual data on all of these countries from 1975 until 2010. And of course, we had some expectations about how these things might correlate, but we had no idea that they were going to cluster as neatly as they actually did. And this is what the data show, that we get 3 different clusters here that are clearly distinct from one another. And the first one is what we call dispersive power sharing. You can see all the different constitutional and institutional provisions that load on that. And it basically has to do with a territorial decentralization of power with federalism and similar kinds of practices. The second column that you see is what we call inclusive power sharing, and it has to do with what you could broadly say, Leiphardt's idea of consociationalism minus the federal part of it. Right? It has to do with a mutual veto, it has to do with reserved seats in the legislature, it has to do with inclusiveness provisions in the armed forces, it has to do with the reserved cabinet posts for ethnic minorities. One interesting thing is that we also, as you may see, we also have a variable here for grand coalition governments, which is another feature mentioned by Leiphardt. It does load on the same factor, but very, very weakly. So this is one sort of unexpected finding, that grand coalition governments are a little different from these other sort of consociational features. And then the third of these factors is what I would call constraining power, what we call constraining power sharing, or what you could interpret very much in a Madisonian sense. It has to do with protection of religious freedoms. It has to do with civilian control of the military. It has to do with the banning of overtly ethnic parties, but it also, and perhaps mainly, has to do with the strength of judicial institutions, as you can see from these factor loadings. Now, here's a graph that shows you what's been happening with these 3 different forms of power sharing in the real world over the period of time that we're looking at. And here we're controlling for the fact that more and more countries have become democratic, and as they've become democratic, they've become more likely to adopt all sorts of power sharing. So we try to subtract that democratization effect and looked at the net effect of these net trend for these forms of power sharing. And you can see that for inclusive and dispersive power sharing, there's not very much of a temporal trend, but for the constraining or Madisonian part, there clearly is. So from the 1990s on, there was a big jump in the frequency of these kinds of institutions, and that has continued up until the present date, or at least until the end of our time series. What does that actually mean for democratic survival? Does power sharing, any of these 3 forms, help democracy survive? That's the kind of concern that I started out with, and that's a concern that we've been trying to test in this in this model here and related research. And what we're simply looking at here is the likelihood that countries that have these institutions are going to survive as democracies over a 5-year period. Right? So it's a 5-year survival rate. You either score a 1 if you survive as a democracy, and of course this analysis is limited to countries that were democratic at some point during this this time period, and you get a 0 if you actually experience a turn to autocracy. So positive coefficients here mean this is an institutional feature that helps sustain democracy. Negative coefficients means this is a feature that helps undermine democracy, if you will. And you can see that we have estimates for the 3 forms of power sharing. In the short version of the story, which is not very hard to tell, is that constraining power share or Madisonian power sharing is the type of power sharing that really works in terms of protecting democracy. And you can see that it works regardless of how many control variables we throw into the equation. You'll see also we're controlling for a whole bunch of other usual suspects, right? We're looking at the religious or ethnic diversity of the population, and you can see that ethno-linguistic fractionalization has a negative impact on democracy. That's not surprising. We're looking at whether there's been a past breakdown of democracy, and you see if that has happened, that has a bad influence on democracy. That's not surprising. We get that result. We're looking at whether your neighborhood makes a difference, and this is good news for people in Europe. If you live in a good neighborhood to begin with, you're much more likely to sustain democracy than if you live in a bad neighborhood to begin with. But we're controlling for that. We're looking at population, doesn't have much of an impact. We're looking at wealth. Wealthier countries are much more likely to survive as democracies than poor countries. That's not surprising. That's what we expect to find. We're looking at fuel dependence, which basically means, are these countries gas and oil exporters? And we find that countries that have those characteristics are less likely to survive as democracies. That's also not terribly surprising. And we're also looking at things like Freedom House scores, which is an independent way of trying to estimate the freedoms and liberties in the countries. And the interesting thing is, Freedom House scores do matter, but they don't do anything to the strength of these constraining power-sharing institutions. And even when we control for these freedoms that you might think might be related to constraining power-sharing, there is no attenuation of the impact of constraining power-sharing. In fact, if you compare models 2 and 3, if you compare model 3 to model 1, you'll see that there's virtually no difference in the estimates for the importance of constraining power sharing. So that leads us to a number of conclusions. And that is, first of all, that what you want to do is to stabilize democracy in countries that are nominally but perhaps feebly democratic to begin with, then constraining power sharing is the only form of power sharing that consistently and significantly stabilizes democracy. And the effect is all in the same order of magnitude as wealth. If you think that wealthy countries are more likely to survive as democracies than poor countries, well, that's true. But countries with constraining power sharing, the difference between countries with strong institutions of that sort and countries without those institutions is just as significant as the effect of wealth. Inclusive power sharing has an impact. This is the sort of Leipardian consociational form of power sharing. Has no significant impact on democratic stability, and dispersive power sharing, federalism, has a negative effect, even though it's quite weak. So I wouldn't make too much of that. If you want to get a sort of a picture of how much of a difference constraining power sharing makes, then look at these numbers. So with all the variables at their means, the 5-year likelihood of democratic survival for all states is 93.3%. So in other words, most democracies survive over a 5-year period. There's about 1 in 15 that don't. But if we increase constraining power sharing by 1 standard deviation, that means a sizable but not radical increase in constraining power sharing. We cut the risk of failure of a transition to autocracy in half. So the risk of failure decreases from 6.7% to 3.4%, almost exactly in half. And we've seen that that effect is robust to all of these controls that I've talked about. There's one caveat that may be interesting to some of you, and that is that inclusive power sharing, which typically has no real impact, is important in some contexts and a small number of contexts, and that is where there's countries that have gone through civil war. A country that is particularly troubled, has recently gone through civil war, inclusive power sharing, all these sort of inclusive arrangements, making sure everybody has a seat at the table, grand coalition governments and so forth, is effective in those, under those circumstances. That, of course, is a small subset of the countries that we've looked at. And even in those circumstances, the effect of constraining power sharing remains strong. All of our control variables have effects on the expected directions. That's good. It gives us increasing confidence in what we're doing. And in some, if I were to summarize what I've said today, I would say Madisonian power sharing has become a lot more common in the world, and there's very strong evidence that it actually helps sustain democracy, and that's good news. And that's really all I wanted to say on a political science topic. But then I have one final note. And I should say, this is not a picture of my father. I couldn't find a picture of my father on the web. This is a picture of Jonathan Edwards, who, as some of you may know, holds the world record in the triple jump. My father never held a world record. He did hold a Norwegian record. He did hold a European record for a short period of time. And maybe he could have done well internationally if he'd been allowed to compete. Now, the Olympics that he was looking forward to were the Tokyo Olympics of 1940. Now, unfortunately, there were no Tokyo Olympics in 1940. Then they were talking for a short while of moving those Olympics to Helsinki. That didn't happen either, for good reasons. Finland was not in a good position to arrange Olympic Summer Games in 1940. There were no Olympics in 1944 either. And so the first Olympics after my father set his records were in 1948, and those were the only international competitions back in those days. So there weren't really a lot of opportunities for my dad. 9 years was too long for him to wait. He wasn't the same athlete in 1948 that he had been in 1939, and he actually never complained about it. I mean, when we think about all the people who lived through the Second World War, my father was a lucky fellow compared to many of the others. I mean, he survived. He had a good life afterwards. Never complained. All of his family survived. There were really no major hardships to complain about. But you might wonder, what could have been? What might have been? What if he had been able to compete? And the best I can do is to say, well, what if my father had been the same athlete, and he'd come up against the people, for example, who competed in the 1948 Olympics? Could he have done well? Well, we can actually look at that. There were Olympics in 1948. Triple jump was on the list of events that they were competing in. And here's the results. So my father's national record in Norway was 15 meters and 49. He set that record in 1939, as I said. It lasted until 1962. And we never know what would have happened, but if you look at these numbers, he might have been able to do quite well. So that's really all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaare. Thanks for this interesting and moving presentation. I now open the floor for a round of questions, knowing that the Madison is also a dance. I don't know if you are aware of that.
That Madison is what?
A dance. A dance. I will show you tonight. It's a dance that we do in...
a dance?
A dance.
Oh.
doing weddings
good.
in France. So
Well, I should keep that in mind for future reference.
for the next. So I take the first question here.
Thank you very much. I'll start by saying that I'm Swedish. Sorry.
Yeah, and I meant no offense to the Swede who actually did win the gold medal at the Olympics. I'm sure he perfectly well did. Thank you.
On the Norwegian tremendous successes in sports lately, and made many Swedes ask for rejuvenation of our old union, and we can get all your gold medals in cross-country. That would be nice.
But your triple jumpers have been better than the Norwegian ones in recent years.
Yeah, right. No, this is of course very interesting from a Swedish perspective as well. And what I'm particularly thinking about is the way Norway, Denmark, and Sweden have dealt with the right-wing parties. I would very much like to hear your analysis about that. In Sweden, the other parties have all decided not to interact with the right wing. They don't discuss with them to the extent that they can avoid it. Sometimes people say this is the wrong way to deal with them. It's better to defend their arguments than to just turn their backs against them. And when I listen to you, I'm not so sure, but it's rather that it's better to turn your back, not letting them be represented at all in the discussion. Or did I get you wrong with it? This is a really crucial issue for all the countries. I think also Germany has something similar to Sweden where the alternative theologian. How do we deal with these people in order to not let them dominate the debate, but to hopefully sink back into oblivion, which we all hope for?
Well, let me begin by saying I think we're talking about a sort of a, maybe this is a bad metaphor, but the world of radical right parties, including the ones in the Scandinavian countries, is really a pretty big and diverse tent. They're quite different from one another. And I don't want to sound like a Sweden basher today, but I think you have some of the less desirable ones in your country. And so I think you have to keep that in mind. I mean, there are different ways of being radical right, and the Norwegian Progress Party, which is one of these parties, which is currently in the government, I think has at least managed to project a considerably more moderate position on sort of some of the most sensitive issues like immigration, for example. That's not saying that there aren't elements of that party too that are quite xenophobic, but I think you are looking at rather different parties, and they're in rather different positions right now. As you say, the Swedish party has been basically ostracized by all the other parties in that system. The Danish party has been very most successful of the party and is sort of playing a supporting role, but not itself participating in the governing coalition. The Norwegian party is currently in the government and in fact holding some important portfolios like the ministry responsible for immigration and asylum provisions. And so I think there are parties that deserve to be ostracized, but I would be very careful about that option, because my own sense is that it's as likely to backfire as anything else. And I think the strength of the radical right-wing parties is much more likely to weaken as a consequence of the issues on which they feed going away than as a consequence of other parties sort of ganging up on them. And so I think the idea of other parties ganging up on them is in some sense what they feed on, right? There's an establishment that's out there to, protect the status quo and quash any kind of dissidence. And the more repressive you get by doing that, I think the more support these parties can potentially get. So that's not the policy that's been followed in Norway. It was for a while that the other parties were basically trying to ignore the Progress Party. I don't think that Norway has suffered particularly by the other parties largely giving up on that policy. But if you see a sufficiently sort of nasty and militant party, I can understand why parties adopt that policy. So that's about as much as I can say. The other thing I would say is, and here's where I would be Madisonian, is the way that you want to meet that is to say, well, okay, we'll let you have the place in Parliament that your votes entitle you to. But we also we have a liberal democracy in this country, and that means we have certain laws, we have certain constitutional commitments to human rights, and we're going to stand by those constitutions, and we're going to make sure that our courts know that, we expect them to uphold those commitments. And that means that there are certain policies that simply aren't on the table because they are against our constitution, they are against our commitment to international human rights and so forth.
Thank you. Another question? Manuel?
First, thanks for your presentation. It was very interesting. I have some 3 comments.
Sure.
One is just about the origin of the Norwegian constitution. Last week I was talking with a Spanish constitutionalist. Was on the one of the is alive is one of the remain alive because it was the creator of the Spanish constitution was Oscar Alzaga, and he was studying that the Norwegian constitution, the first. It was just a copy of the Spanish constitution. The first Spanish constitution was of 1812. Was the first Spanish constitution, and he said the Norwegian constitution was a copy of this one. So we have the Spanish constitution alive in some way. I don't know if you know something about it, but maybe I don't know.
I don't know. That is news to me. That is interesting news. First of all, that could still be true and be consistent with what I'm saying, that, for example, the influence went through the Spanish Constitution. If the Norwegian Constitution, we know something about the people who wrote that Constitution. There was one, just like James Madison was the architect of the U.S. Constitution, there was a fellow, Christian Magnus Folsen, who's been recognized as the Norwegian James Madison. So he wrote a major part of the Constitution. And so we know what sort of sources he had and what kind of inspirations he had. And there's no doubt that they were influenced by France, they were influenced by Dutch constitutions, and they were influenced by American constitutions and and they were influenced by Montesquieu, they were influenced by John Locke, and, political philosophers, and James Madison and his colleagues. But there may have been an indirect influence, and I don't know about the Spanish Constitution, so you'd have to tell me about that. But if the Spanish Constitution was influenced by the same documents and the same thinkers, then it's not surprising that you find striking similarities between the Spanish Constitution and the Norwegian Constitution. But I have to say, when the Norwegian Constitution just celebrated its bicentennial 2 years ago, right, 2014, it was 200 years, and I had a chance to, I wrote a book chapter about the influence of the American Constitution on the Norwegian Constitution, and I appeared in a panel at National Constitution Center in Washington, D.C., along with a Norwegian historian of the Constitution who had really spent a lot of time digging into this. I have to say he said nothing about the Spanish Constitution as a source of inspiration. It's possible that it existed and he just didn't know about it. But I'm simply ignorant. But he knows more about the historical background than I did, and much of my knowledge about it stems from him and from other similar kinds of sources.
Yes, go ahead.
I have paid attention to the manifesto project, and I discovered that the polarization is not very high. I mean, not nowadays, but in 2010, 2000 until
the ideological
polarization
distance
is not really high. I mean, in terms of programs, of party programs, is not really high. So when you have a extreme right, extreme left, but in fact the content of the programs are not polarizing. And the third question is just about the main topic of your presentation is about problems with democracy. When we are thinking about the situation of democracy in the old time, before the Second World War, the problem looks like is just legitimacy of democracy. I mean, at the same time that the efficiency in terms of economic efficiency and all these things was going down, legitimacy was also going down. That maybe, I don't know, you have considered that. That's all.
I think you're quite right. What I worry about, and so it's clear, I mean, democracy has a huge advantage today over democracy as it existed back in the 1930s, and that is democracy is sort of is widely considered by a lot of sort of nice people around the world as the only game in town, right? And in fact, most of the other options have been discredited, and partly as a consequence of World War II, right? And so that helps a lot. I think democracy is a lot less fragile today. The threat picture is also a little different. So what happened here in this city, in Paris, in different parts of the world, New York City, it's not the same threat that the March on Rome or these sort of fascist movements of the 1920s and 1930s. But the other part of what you said does bother me somewhat, and I only have to look at my own adopted country to sort of be concerned about this, and that is prolonged periods of low or negative economic growth may work to undermine legitimacy, even if the sort of alternatives are not well spelled out. If nobody wants to openly say we want something other than democracy, there's increasing numbers of people willing to embrace movements and candidates whose vision of democracy may not be widely shared by this community, for example. Right? And they may or may not be willing to play by the rules, and I'm willing to believe that many of them do want to play by the rules by and large. But it's a much more populist version of democracy, and it's not a commitment that I would, Again, I mean, there's all sorts of variants of extremism, and I think, some of these parties, as you say, the ideological distance may not be that large. I don't think they represent a really fundamental threat, but there are parties in that sort of broad category that I think have quite a different vision, and their commitment to democracy, I wouldn't trust all that far.
Yes, Mr.
We see the rise, even in the country where you live, the rise of people who are not much different from those Swedish and other people you are talking about. And I have some skepticism about the idea that these are just bad people who pop up without any reason.
They're just bad people.
They are just bad people who pop up without any reason, that the people who are supporting them, I'm not talking about the leaders or presidential candidates or not, but it is just a question of looking at the reasons why did it happen that so many people are giving so much support to such extreme ideas. So I think simply dismissing them or saying that they have to be tackled is not an answer to something which comes from some social realities and how progress was made by stealth without consulting a lot of people and then coming to a result which a part of the population is very unhappy with. That would be one point. The other point is just the question of the deadlock of government when you have the instrument to preserve and extend democracy, which you have been talking about, the balance of power. And then it might also be something which people now call between Congress and President, for example, in the United States as deadlock. And then how do you overcome it? So basically, it might have a double-edged function. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with you on the first point. I think there's a reason that people support the movements they do support, even when we might think that they have unattractive features, and I think I think insecurity is a big part of that picture, and economic insecurity is certainly part of that insecurity, but there's a broader sense of insecurity. I think that's at large. I mean, what sort of community do I live in? Do I recognize this community? Will people? Can I still count on my neighbors to play by the rules that I come to expect people to play by? And those you have. I mean, those are legitimate concerns. So I think you have to start by really trying to identify those concerns, and some of them, people are sometimes nasty and prejudiced, and you don't have to cater to their nastiness and prejudices. But I think they also that movements don't get that big if they don't appeal to anything but the sort of the irrational and ill-supported concerns that people. These people get where they are by appealing to real concerns that people have about their lives and about their societies. So I agree with you on that part, and that's why I'm skeptical about sort of trying to ostracize them. And again, I mean, if somebody walks around wearing swastikas, then I think that's one thing, and there's a legitimate case for not wanting to have those people in government. But I think there's a lot of shades that you have to take far more seriously, in the sense of thinking about the real issues that they speak to. The other issue about deadlock, this is the downside of presidentialism, essentially, and I think the underlying motivation for a system of checks and balances is that there's some overall gain to all parties from coming to agreement. That there's some overall commitment that overrides their differences. Sometimes it's getting harder to see that commitment now. I mean, Madison was writing at a time when the U.S. was basically facing what looked like a hugely uphill battle against the most important, the strongest military power in the world. You're trying to break away from that. And you knew that if you lost that fight, they'd all lose their lives, basically. That's what they were facing. And in that situation, it's not hard to see that, yes, you can count on some overall, everybody's going to be committed to victory in that battle. Today, that sort of basic commitment to agreement is probably a lot harder to find. And if there's something that worries me about how the U.S. politics is playing out, that probably is is one of the most important things.
Madam?
I'm just going back to the far right points that we made a minute ago. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I find your constraining power sharing point quite useful and interesting. My question is more about, okay, so and I'm thinking about Europe here, not the entire world. So it seems to me that one of the implications of your argument is that if one of the symptoms of the problems of democracy is the far right, one way to address it potentially would be through essentially enhancing protection of freedom and minority rights and so on, which is kind of a liberal perspective. And I agree with that. My fear is that potentially, especially because these parties are actually against minority rights, essentially, and some of their supporters are against minority rights, is there a possibility that this would create a backlash? So instead of rectifying the problem, actually something else happening? And are you trying to address that through taking this away from electoral politics and bringing it to courts? Was that your idea? Because that's what I thought you said, okay, we need to give more powers to courts to enhance this and implement that. So what are your thoughts on that?
First of all, I would be careful you talk about minority rights, but I would be careful to say that what Madison formulated and what most international human rights agreements emphasize is individual rights. And I think individual rights are a lot less controversial to these right-wing parties. So in other words, I wouldn't necessarily say we should now have Muslims represented on all city councils, and the Muslim population should have a right to a certain percentage of. But I would say in terms of individual rights, people should not be discriminated against because they're Muslims, right? And I think the latter idea has a broader appeal than the former idea, and the latter idea would have a broader appeal, I think, particularly among the people that you worry about, who are potential supporters of the radical right parties.
Okay, we take a last questions by Ian Cooper, and then we'll stop.
Actually, my question is slightly wonky and a little bit on the lighter side. It's about Norwegian democracy. My understanding is that I'm wondering about the Madisonian influence, because in Norway, when the parliament you have an election and then the cabinet is formed, the members of the cabinet leave the parliament, and then the next person on the list takes their place. So
that's right.
Maintains a formal separation of power between the executive and the legislature. And until 2009, you also had this really strange modified unicameralism, where the body would split into two for certain purposes. You had an upper house and a lower house. I'm wondering whether these are vestiges of Madisonianism, and whether there are others like that are kind of that you didn't talk about.
That's a fun set of questions to get, and so again, let me play amateur historian here again. Actually, at the Norwegian Constitutional Convention in 1814, the people who drew up the Norwegian Constitution, there was a important division among them and a battle between them, among the people who basically wanted a constitution that exhibited a lot of checks and balances along Madisonian lines. And Folsen, this constitutional architect that I mentioned, was one of the people who stood for that line. But there was another group of people who thought that the main idea that they wanted embodied in the Constitution was popular sovereignty and popular equality, right? And they fought it out. And so, so the Norwegian Constitution is not all of one mind. It reflects divisions and sort of concerns that of different groups on that. And then there was a sort of a third And there were also very sort of protective nationalists who, made it sure that they banned Jews and Catholics from the country, which was not their finest hour, but be that as it may. And so what they ended up with was a constitution that was a bit of a mix of these different elements. And the sort of modified unicameralism that you mentioned was one of the most peculiar reflections of that, because at the Constitutional Convention, one of the big fights was between the unicameralists and the bicameralists, right? And Folsom was one of the bicameralists, and he looked to the American founding fathers and said, we should have a bicameral legislature like they do. And the unicameralists were saying, and the implicit message was we should have an upper house that can sort of keep a check on the lower house, and if the peasants in the lower house, and of course that's what most Norwegians were at the time, get out of hand, then we'll have these more educated people in the upper house, and they could provide a check on that so we don't get too strange legislation coming out of Parliament. And then the unicameralists, well, they were the popular sovereignty people, the egalitarians, and they said, no, everybody should be equal, and as an extension of that, we should have only one chamber. And then eventually they came to this kind of silly compromise, and I have to say, not all compromises are compromises that make sense, right? This is one of the ones that didn't. So they said, we'll make a compromise so that we'll elect everybody in the same way, and then once they get together, they'll select 1/4 of the members among themselves. They will make up the upper division of Parliament. The rest of the members will be the lower division, and then all the bills, non-financial bills, will have to go through both divisions. And over time, that became an anachronism. It had no real effect. It did actually. The one feature of that division that actually made a difference was something they probably didn't think very seriously about, and that was that the impeachment court, that the upper division also served as the majority of the members of the impeachment court, and that actually was through that kind of an impeachment by where the liberals stacked the upper chamber with their members. That was how parliamentary democracy was introduced in Norway in 1884. This is not something the founders had anticipated. And that's the only significant difference that this sort of weird system of modified unicameralism ever made in the 190 years that it existed. So I think it was a silly compromise, but that's what it was.
Thanks a lot, Kaare Strøm, for this nice presentation. And yes, we are very pleased that you did it.
Thank you so much.